So once again, good morning. Thanks for showing up. Let's get right into it. So I want to talk about this reality that we've all experienced, that we're all involved in this process of becoming more conscious and sort of, wanting to make changes, but then we find ourselves back in the same old ruts. And so I want to suggest, it's not so much that you're stuck, but you're on repeat. And obviously this applies to me as well. And I want to explore how it is that we're on repeat, and maybe suggest that it's possible not to do that. It's particularly challenging when we're talking about people pleasing or trying to live your own life, a life of full self-expression, moment by moment, and not contort oneself to appease the group or to appease another person or be liked, to all of that. Because by the time we're adults, this people-pleasing behavior is more than a habit. It's actually an identity that it's an image of ourselves that we attach to and are pretty committed to because of fear and because of shame. So I want to start with something quite simple here. And that is that we're on repeat. And you've probably had the experience of, you do your work. You got the insight, finally. You're understanding with, intellectually where this comes from. And yet you find yourself doing the same thing over and over again. So I'm going to present here a way of understanding your life, but I'm going to use the work of a mathematician and philosopher whose name is A.N. Whitehead, who is responsible for what's called process philosophy. And I'll try to make this sort of as simple and as relatable as possible. But his basic premise and why he uses process is that the self is actually not a fixed self. It's you and I are a process, not a static self that we bring to every situation and changing circumstance of our life. And similarly, your life is not a thing per se. It's not static. It's something that is happening moment by moment, like a series of experiences. And in each of these moments, something very specific is happening. And according to Whitehead, you are taking in your past. You are feeling your past, and then you're responding. And he used a word for this. He called it prehension. It's like apprehension, only you take the app off and you get prehension. And it simply means the way that the past is felt in the present, not just remembered, but felt. So it's the felt experience of the past in the present. So when something happens in your life, like we call it psychologically or emotionally a trigger, someone looks at you a certain way, there's a tone of voice, somebody's pulling away, someone doesn't respond to something that you said, someone is disappointed in you. It's not just happening. You're not responding to what's happening now. You respond to what it feels like. And what it feels like is shaped by the memory of the past. And I don't know, someone's microphone is on. I don't know if that's you, Keith. If you could turn it off, that'd be great. So And this is why it feels so real, so immediate, so true. Is it's because of the power of the feeling associated with it. So it has to be true, my interpretation of the experience I'm having right now, because it's the feeling is so deep. But the critical thing is that you realize that that feeling might be unrelated to the present moment. And in all likelihood, at least in my experience, you're reacting to a past feeling. And that's why I talk about, when we're triggered, we need to ask ourselves the question, am I in a memory? Can I accurately interpret, accurately perceive what is happening? So, for example, it happens all the time, especially in intimate relationships where your partner does something or says something, and you're certain that they're trying to humiliate you or shame you or that they're angry with you. And I've learned not to trust my initial response. And so we have this little ritual where I just say, like when you said that, were you trying to humiliate me? Were you trying to embarrass me? Um, and it's actually never true. It's never true. Uh, but it's hard to believe that it's not true because the feeling is so strong. And the feeling of the past, particularly as it relates to the identity of people pleasing, if you follow the breadcrumbs all the way back, there's shame and there's fear and the defensiveness that arises out of that because we don't want to feel the humiliation. So in the present, we're feeling the presence of the past and reacting to that. We're in a memory. And if that's all there was, then we would be completely determined by the past. We would be, as Jung says, I don't know the exact quote, but he says, unless you do the work of making the unconscious conscious, you're going to feel the presence of the past. You're going to call it your fate. And if we go to Whiteheadian language, he might say, when the past completely overtakes the present, there is no openness, no flexibility, no new responses possible. So we're operating from a sealed self. And this sealed self I call the ego, or the trying self, or the false self, or the performative self. So there's a kind of psychological and emotional rigidity. And in other words, the self, even though the self is a process, the self actually becomes static. It becomes a thing if we're not aware of how we're being influenced by the past. And if it's extremely rigid, we call that psychosis, because the past is so dominant that nothing new can enter, nothing new can happen, and most of us aren't there. But if you follow that continuum from psychosis to neurosis to kind of psychological, emotional, spiritual well-being, you could call it neurosis, right? And I think that people pleasing is a form of neurosis when the self is it's mostly impermeable to the presence of possibility. And so it's mostly closed down, but there's still some porousness. Because when we think about people pleasing, people pleasing is the past organizing the present. That's a good way. And I would say, in my definition, that's what I mean by ego. Because, I've talked about this before, but there are these core unconscious beliefs, these conclusions we came to as little ones when we were just in formation, and like, I don't matter, I don't belong, I'm not enough, I need to be good to be loved, it's my fault. And so what happens is, in the present moment, if these core unconscious beliefs or conclusions we came to are active, have not been dissolved or come into relationship with, then you just have to adapt, adjust, perform. You got to read the room for what's happening, because your dignity is on the line as a human being. So you're trying to get it right. You're going along to get it wrong. You're trying to be perfect. And the thing is about it, as you've probably noticed, if you've got some of this identity going, it works. Like, it works in terms of survival. But at some point as adults, we realize that it actually, what helped us to survive gets in the way of us living our own life, a life of self-expression, what I call the heart self, which we'll get to in a moment. So, so now the past is repeating itself, and it's repeating itself through you, as you, in you. You are the presence of the past. I would even say that the ego is the presence of the past. And but the trick is to catch on that you are not the ego, right? It's just the ego is the past, personalized, localized, and then repeated in you. And so at some point, if we're lucky, we begin to feel that we're imprisoned. We begin to feel that we're not acting in freedom. That is, our life is not our own. But here's where another idea from Whitehead, I think, can liberate us. And it's very helpful to me. And that is that every moment is not just shaped by the past. That would be like Darwinian or neo-Darwinian evolution, where nothing new can happen once an organism has reached its perfected final state. That's what it is and who it is. But the present moment is also open to something new happening. And he called this the creative advance into novelty. The creative advance into novelty. So in every moment, there's a possibility. I would say that there's a domain of infinite possibility that we can actually tap into. There's a new way of being. There's a way of recovering the self as process rather than as a static thing that we bring to every situation. And at first it's very subtle. But the key to our own liberation is to find a way to evoke some porousness in the identity, in the case that we're exploring, of the people pleaser. And there's a lot of like spiritual traditions and lineages that have talked about this. The one I'm most familiar, but it's in every lineage, but the one I'm most familiar with is the Christian one. And there's a Catholic priest and paleontologist whose name is Teilhard de Chardin, who talks about this, just call it a power, as the omega point, or as Christ consciousness, or the heart of the Christ. It's like an alluring force that draws us from this domain of infinite possibilities to full realization. And for Teilhard de Chardin, it was the realization of love and compassion localized as you and as me. And it's not about forcing this or controlling this or making this happen or meditating for 40 years. It's more a matter of dropping in to this always already presence of what Teilhard de Chardin called the divine milieu. And that is actually the milieu that we exist in and we can connect with. And that's where, in the Jewish scriptures, the prophet Isaiah is speaking on behalf of God at one point to the prophet, says, "Behold, I'm doing a new thing. It is springing forth now. Do you not perceive it?" So this divine milieu is that which, in which future possibilities are present now and available, and we can tap into this milieu and choose what kind of lifeline, if to use that language, we want to tap into. And then this creative advance into novelty, the self as process, can happen. And so it enables us to respond in a new way, as a new thing, to use Isaiah's words, to the changing conditions. And so we discover that the self is emergent. It's it's a process we discover when we have shifted out of ego and this enclosed static thing into this presence that is free to respond in a new way and is actually the presence of novelty. And this divine milieu, which I just call, when it's personalized as you, is the heart. And it's always calling if we learn to listen. It's a still small voice. That it's the intuition that comes not from reason or logic or good planning or calculating. It comes from, you could call it the future, but it's future possibilities present now, and that's the heart self. So when we talk about psychological, emotional, spiritual health, it's not so much the absence of the past, but it's the ability to feel the past without being completely determined by it. And that's why in the work that I do, the key is to come into a compassionate relationship with the past, with your own past, which is to come into a compassionate relationship with ego, to be grateful for the way in which it helped you survive, but then to gain the capacity through compassion because to drop into the heart self. And when I say, how do I do this? How do I do this? So the strange thing is, the moment you are able to feel tenderness toward yourself, you are already the presence of the heart self turned towards your egoic self. It's already there. It was never not present. So it's never a matter of trying harder, striving to find it, having to do spiritual work. I'm not denigrating any of that, but it's actually much simpler. So one of the questions is like, well, how do you make this tight, egoic, contracted, impermeable, or almost impermeable static thing that we call the self or the ego that we're identified with more porous, more open to becoming a process, an emergent process rather than a thing? And I'll just give one possibility, and that is actually feeling what's been waiting to come up, because we've had to repress and suppress all kinds of feelings. So and one of those feelings is the most dominant one is the presence of grief for the way in which we were forced to contract to become this static self as a way of defending ourselves against humiliation and shame. And the impact and the suffering that that has caused us and that we've generated because of that. And so up comes this grief. And it's learning the competency of being able to be with that rather than run from it. That the grief itself kind of creates the permeability. It's what reconnects us with the heart self that was, as I say, always already present. So we have this relationship with the ego, but the problem with the ego is the only feeling that it has, it's defending itself against the deep feelings of shame and sorrow and rage and hatred and all the shadow stuff. But when we can allow those feelings through kind of titration, just come to terms with them, like accept them, and then love ourselves in the midst of that, then this creative advance into novelty becomes possible. We become a new creation, living in relationship with the past, but not being determined by it. So this is the work of opening up the people pleaser identity into this divine milieu that is localized in and as our heart self. Just checking in with myself to see if there's anything more I want to say about that. I think I feel complete, and I'd love to hear what came up for you as I was talking. Maybe there are questions that you have. Maybe there's just, you just want to share something, which is fine as well. Just unmute yourself, and I'm going to go back and stop the recording at this point.